So tonight is now post-COVID. We held a program last year with a couple of ambassadors on U.S. foreign policy, looking back at U.S. foreign policy. That was supposed to be our 50th anniversary program. Of course, it became the 50+1 because of COVID. So this is 50+2, and we are delighted to have Ambassador Herbst with us. Again, the video that was playing was pre-recorded by President Zelensky to play at the UN, but Madam Zelenskaya and Ambassador Makarova had gone to the UN in person to appeal to the UN for aid of all sorts, weapons, money, plain old support. If you were listening to the video at all earlier today, when it was broadcast, he asks that Russia be stripped of its veto power in the Security Council because it is not paying attention to the UN Charter. So we'll talk about some of those things today. Much better, says Doug and Vicky. So I think you guys are on the right track. So anybody want to know why President Zelensky did not come to the United Nations himself? It's a serious question.
Busy elsewhere.
He is busy elsewhere. But what if he left Ukraine? And so there's not just the image of that, but there's the actual physical threat that if he is not at home, does it signal that others can move in? And so these are important maneuverings by a person who understands just how precarious his position is and just how important our position is in the world to support him. So Shelley, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It's better. Okay, they're going to keep working on it, but I think we can get started. Yeah? All right. Go ahead, Professor. Professor. He is like a professor. I have already learned a lot from him. So, Ambassador Herbst, please.
Okay, Angela, thank you. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm going to take you back in history a little bit to introduce this topic. There is a theory of, or an imperial history of Russia that goes back to the 18th century. And there's a line of very distinguished Russian historians who have taught this imperial history to this very day. And this is an important part of understanding what's happening right now in Ukraine. According to this Russian imperial history, the Russian nation was founded in the city of Kiev in 988. And because that city was overrun by the Mongols when they made their strong advance to the west in 1240, the center of Russian life moved to the forests of the north, and the city that ultimately emerged as the leader of this new Russia after a period of 100 or so years was Moscow. And so the genealogy of Russian history runs from Kievan Rus to the Boyarzstvo, or the Duchy of Muscovy, to the Russian Empire, which they will associate with ultimately Peter the Great, but actually Ivan III was the great gatherer of Russian lands in Russian imperial history, then the Soviet Union, and now post-Soviet Russia. This history, which is taught to every Russian school child and has been taught to them for 250 years roughly, has also become the basis for history in all college courses in the United States. Because when the Russian Revolution happened, eminent Russian intellectuals left Russia, and some of them became professors of history at Harvard and Yale and taught this history. And I'm telling you this for two reasons. One, this understanding in Russia explains the nasty war of aggression that Moscow is currently conducting in Ukraine. And two, most Americans learn this history as quote unquote real objective history, which it is not. It's a view of history made by Russians of an imperial mindset. And there is a Ukrainian view of their own history, which starts with that same Kiev in 988, then goes to the Duchy of Galicia to the west, then to the Cossack Hetmanate in the 17th century, then briefly an independent Ukraine at the end of World War I, and the independent Ukraine you see today. Needless to say, Russian imperial people do not accept Ukraine's history of itself. I'm not telling you that one is right or one is wrong. I'm telling you that these are two different histories belonging to two different peoples. And we need to understand that as we look at what's happening in Ukraine today. Okay, so what's happening in Ukraine today? The Soviet Union fell apart at the end of 1990. And it fell apart because an agreement was made between the leaders of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Not because the CIA engineered some masterly thing to tear the Soviet Union apart. And the reason why the president of Russia, Yeltsin, wanted this to happen is because the Soviet Union existed and Gorbachev was the head of the Soviet Union, and he and Yeltsin were rivals. So how do you win in a contest like that? You make your opponent's political vehicle disappear, which is what happened. Something called the Bielovesia Accords. The Soviet Union fell apart. All the separate republics, the 16 republics that made up the Soviet Union, became independent nations. Some reluctantly, most happily. Ukraine was one of those that happily became independent after a referendum in which 91% of the population said, we want to be independent. That despite the fact that approximately 17 or 18% of the Ukrainian population were ethnic Russian. Which means, if you do simple math, that even if every vote against independence was Russian, roughly 45% of Russians in Ukraine wanted Ukraine to be independent. In other words, independent from Moscow. Russia never really accepted that vote. And I could recommend a wonderful book to you by a Ukrainian-American historian named Serhiy Plokhy, who teaches at Harvard, something called The End of Empire. 450 pages, it's a fat book, but it's an easy read. He's a masterful writer. He handles this material really well. And what you learn if you read that book, among other things, is that Gorbachev, right, the last leader of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin, the first leader of independent Russia, both men considered by our lights enlightened, kind of liberal for a Russian, both were appalled at the notion of Ukraine being independent of Russia. Now, there were various games that the Kremlin played in Ukraine in the 90s that ultimately were not significant in the 90s because Yeltsin was interested in a good relationship with the United States. And by and large, he did things on the foreign policy side that were not inconsistent with American interests. But then at the end of the 90s, Yeltsin leaves the scene. He's old and feeble, but he's also discredited because of corruption in Russia. And he's replaced by his hand-picked successor, Vladimir Putin. Who is Vladimir Putin? There's one thing you need to know about him. He spent his entire working life before the Soviet Union fell apart in the KGB. I don't need to tell you who the KGB is, correct? Good. If you want to know the headquarters, the conservators, the worshipers of Russian imperial history, It's the KGB. So Putin comes into power. He starts off in a relationship of some cordiality with the United States and the West. But by 2004, and that date I choose precisely, it's clear that Putin's Russia and the United States on the one and the West on the other side are on a collision course. First, when Putin took over, he began to whittle away the elements of democracy that Yeltsin had established, starting first and foremost with the television stations, which he took control of. He then seized control of the rest of the media, the major media, and the economy. Began to crack down, although gently, slowly, on human rights, and began to talk back, not just against American policy in general, but especially American policy, Western policy, in Russia's neighborhood. I was in Ukraine working at our embassy during the Orange Revolution. And the Orange Revolution occurred in 2004. That revolution, which is a little bit of a dramatic name, centered around the Ukrainian presidential election of 2004, which the authorities tried to steal from the opposition leader, Viktor Yushchenko. When that happened, there was a massive demonstration which continued on the streets of Kyiv for weeks and weeks and weeks. And finally, there was a political resolution which called for a new election, monitored closely by the international community, which the opposition leader won. Putin worked actively and unsuccessfully to ensure the victory of the authorities' candidate, a guy whose name you may know because it's Viktor Yanukovych, who, after he lost that election, wound up winning a fair election and became president of Ukraine in 2010. Why am I going through this? To give you a sense of the relevant background to this current crisis. Putin began 3 years later to actively oppose Western and specifically American interests in his neighborhood in the first instance, but globally as well. He gave a famous speech at the February 2007 Munich Security Conference in which he condemned American foreign policy and spoke of a Russian way, and a Russian way which included something called managed democracy, which is a fancy word for autocracy with a democratic veneer. And that followed the following year with Russia's war against Georgia, for which Putin paid no price. Some criticism, but no price. Then Ukraine, under President Yanukovych, in 2013, was negotiating a trade agreement with the European Union. And Putin said, no, I don't want you to do that. And he put major sanctions on Ukraine's economy because Ukraine still had a close economic relationship with Russia. This led to protests in Ukraine when Yanukovych stopped negotiations with the EU just before they were about to sign this trade agreement. Tens of thousands of demonstrators appeared in Kyiv. This was in late November of 13. Yanukovych cracked down with his police on the demonstrators, thinking he had solved his problem. And 3 days later, there weren't 60,000 people on the streets in Kyiv. There were several hundred thousand. And thus began the death agonies of the Yanukovych government. His government finally fell when he fled the country in late-ish February of 2014. After a week in which snipers were firing from the tops of Kyiv's buildings on protesters, over 100 people were murdered. And those snipers were either specially trained Ukrainian troops, actually not troops, police, or Russian special forces who were in Kiev to protect Yanukovych and actually to not just monitor, but direct the way Yanukovych's forces were dealing with the crowds. Yanukovych fled. A week later, what were called the Little Green Men appeared in Crimea. These were Russian soldiers with their emblems torn off their shoulders. And within a week or so, Russia controlled Crimea. And a month later, the Russians annexed Crimea, because it was not recognized internationally. A month after that, in April of 2014, Moscow began its hybrid war on Ukraine. In the East, by hybrid war, I mean a war led by Russian professionals, funded and armed by the Russians, involving locals who volunteered or were signed up, but because they could not sign up enough locals, they had to bring in more Russian forces, Russian troops, to run this thing. The Western response to the Crimean seizure and annexation was about as weak as its response to Putin's war on Georgia in 2008. Some very minor sanctions. The war in the East prompted serious Western sanctions about 3 months later, in July and August of 2014. The US put down some serious economic sanctions on Russia in July. The European sanctions came later, and some argue it was only because, and you may remember this, the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine by a Russian anti-aircraft system, which Russian propaganda tried to blame on the Ukrainians, but it was Russian and demonstrated by very, very close investigations afterwards. And on that airplane were 200 Danish citizens, no, not Danish, Dutch citizens, and others. And so the European sanctions came down. All right. That's the immediate backdrop to what we've seen this year. For 8 years, Putin was trying via this quasi-covert, not really quite covert war, which involved, well, actually, excuse me, I forgot to mention one very important thing. The Russians had success initially in this covert war from April through July of 14. In May of 14, there was a presidential election in Ukraine. Poroshenko won. After he became president, which was late May, he organized Ukraine's defense forces for a counterstrike to take back at least Donbass. And they were in the process of taking more and more territory until early August. The Russians sent in their regular forces. They defeated the Ukrainians at the Battle of Ilovaisk decisively, which ensured their control over what they called the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic. You then had negotiations, the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements came in duplicate. There was one in September of 14 following the Ukrainian defeat at Ilovaisk. Then the Russians started a new offensive in December of 14, which culminated in them seizing more territory around the southern town of Mariupol, which you've undoubtedly heard of because of the big fight for Mariupol last year. Not last year, this year. And there was a second Minsk Accord. Okay, that's the backdrop to the latest developments, the big invasion of February 22. Putin had counted on this quasi-covert hybrid war to achieve his goal of either establishing a friendly government in Kyiv or, at a minimum, a government that was going to pursue a Russian-oriented foreign policy. But as it turns out, 8 years into Putin's great adventure in Ukraine, this had not happened. And to Putin's surprise, unhappy surprise, the sanctions that were put down in 2014, which had to be renewed by the EU every 6 months, never came undone. In other words, they remained in force, exerting a real impact on the Russian economy. But we're talking about maybe costing their economy 1 or 2 points of GDP per year. Not a huge hit, but a solid hit. And anyone who knows anything about compound interest understands how over time it could be serious. So Putin decided this year to go in large with 200,000 troops, air power, rockets, Navy, the whole 9 yards. So it could not be hidden. It could not be a covert war. It was a massive invasion. Now, since I'm talking to you as an authority, let me tell you that I got wrong the fact that Putin was going to invade. I thought that given the solid policy that the Biden administration outlined in response to impending invasion, that Putin would see it was too risky to invade. I was wrong. Not the first time in my career. But the reason I said that is still important. As a result of this invasion, the West has united on the Russian problem as never before. Sweden and Finland are joining NATO, a major strategic setback for Russia. Russia is under far more punishing sanctions now than it was just a year ago, just 9 months ago. And NATO has substantially increased its troop presence along Russia's border. So even if Putin were able to seize Ukraine, it would still be a major, major strategic defeat for Russia. But Putin didn't really seem to understand that. And he went in. And this is important. This is Putin's war. It's not the Russian people's war, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And it's not even Putin's cronies' war. His business pal cronies didn't like this because they didn't like sanctions. The men of power around Putin, there's a Russian word, siloviki, which means people of power, the guys who run the army and the various secret police and the intelligence services and the Ministry of Interior, aka the police. If you go back and look at the videos of Putin talking to them 2 days before he launched the invasion, they're sitting there appalled. He even reamed one of them out, Narishkin, for not being enthusiastic. And then the weekend after the invasion, he does another video with his defense minister, Shoigu, and his chief military guy, Gerasimov, to say, we're raising our nuclear alert, trying to threaten us. They're looking there like little puppy dogs. Now, who's this guy? So the signal is coming out very clearly. This is Putin's war. Okay. The United States, you probably heard about the nicest thing I'm going to say about the Biden administration already, because I have some problems with their approach. The United States got right what I got wrong, that Putin was going in and going in large. That's to their credit. And they, in fact, did a good job publishing bit by bit their intelligence estimates to throw Putin off balance as he was preparing. But while they got spectacularly right what Putin was up to, they got spectacularly wrong what was going to happen once he invaded and what Ukraine was going to do. They thought Ukraine was going to fold, as the cliche goes, like a cheap suit, and that Russia was going to seize the capital, Kyiv, and topple the Zelensky government within a week or so. As you know, didn't happen. And the administration, since the months before the invasion to this very moment, has been timid in implementing the excellent policy framework that it developed to deal with Kremlin aggression. I got wrong the invasion. I got right that Ukraine was not going to, that Kyiv was not going to fall within weeks, and that Ukraine was going to win this war because I knew the country. And I knew what Washington should have known, because they had a lot of smart people at our embassy in Kyiv telling them this, that the Ukrainian people were all in defending their country because they knew the alternative was something very, very unpalatable. Unpalatable, by the way, in ways that our intelligence predicted, that Putin was going to wage a war of quasi-extermination on Ukraine. This is a war of war crimes where civilians are deliberately targeted, women are deliberately raped, children are deliberately abducted and sent to Russia to become little Russians. That number, by the way, is 260,000, according to credible Ukrainian sources. And Russian media and the former president of Russia, Putin's own mini-me, Medvedev, has said publicly, we need to destroy the concept of Ukrainianness. And we need to destroy Ukrainians. So let them become Russians. Between this rhetoric and the war crimes, some scholars of genocide say this is a war of genocide. I'm a little bit hesitant to say that, but it's plausible, so I'm putting it out there for you to understand or to have. All right. So this is the war that's being conducted. Putin's defeated around Kyiv, which he's going to take very quickly. That was done with some American equipment, but far, far less than the Ukrainians needed. One good thing on our policy towards Ukraine that Trump did, that Obama famously refused to do, was send them Javelin missiles which kill tanks. So Ukraine had enough Javelins going into this big invasion. But they needed many more things, most immediately Stingers, and Stingers are anti-aircraft missiles which hit aircraft flowing at relatively low altitudes of, say, 10,000 feet or less. Actually, they're great at 5,000 feet and below. They're okay at 5,000 and 10,000. They're worthless above 10,000 feet. We only sent them the first Stingers in early February, just before the invasion, and adequate numbers weeks after the big invasion. And there's a whole host of other military equipment Ukrainians properly requested in order to not just defend themselves, but ultimately beat the Russians, which we continue to send to them in small quantities after initially saying no. Okay. April, Moscow realized it can't take Kyiv. It says, okay, our objectives are simply to take control of Donbass in the east. And they regrouped their forces. They took a major pounding around Kyiv and around other cities in the north of Ukraine. They put them together again. They added some others from outside Ukraine and began a major offensive in the east using their 10, 15 to 1 advantage in heavy artillery, in tanks, in planes, and slowly grinding forward, imposing significant casualties on Ukrainians. Ukrainians did not take great casualties in the battles for Kyiv. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are begging us for longer range artillery. We were sending them artilleries once we opened began to first open the gates on weapons mid-March. We began to send them artillery with a range of 40 kilometers. They began to beg for something much longer. After no, Ukraine getting pounded, in early June, we decided to send longer range artillery, but not long range artillery. I'll explain that in a minute. With a range up to 85 kilometers. Significant improvement. We give them something that you probably know this phrase, none of us knew a year ago, HIMARS, which is a very mobile artillery system. It can, to use the phrase, shoot and scoot. Scooting is important so that the artillery doesn't get bombed by return fire and destroyed. We sent them that in small numbers, 12, I think it is. But they were so effective, they stopped the Russian offensive. Suddenly, the Russians were not moving forward anymore. The Russian offensive in Donbass stopped by mid-July. Then, 3 or 4 weeks later, the Ukrainians began to tell the world that they're going to do a counteroffensive in the south, the city of Kherson. And they made some progress in the suburbs of Kherson. But their real game, and they faked everybody out, most importantly the Russians, but also us, was in the east. So the Russians begin moving forces from the northeast of Ukraine, and that's where the Ukrainians strike. And by the 10th, 11th of September, when I'm in Kiev, the extent of the Ukrainian victory with this counteroffensive becomes public. And they've taken back more territory than Russia has seized since it began its April offensive. I've seen figures first of like 3,500 square kilometers. Now it's over 5,000. A major, major victory, but they were smart from the leadership on down to say, this is good, but the tide has not turned. You can't say that we're now in the driver's seat. But they say, we want to get back all of our territory that's been taken by the Russians, and please give us all these other weapons you've refused to give us so far. And the list includes, and by the way, there's an excellent article in the Wall Street Journal on September 10, which gives the list. And I can tell you that list has been an open secret in Washington, Kiev for the last 3 months. It means fighter aircraft, both Soviet-era MiGs, but then our fighter aircraft. It means tanks, Soviet-era tanks, but then Western tanks, of which we have many that we're retiring, M1s. It includes armored personnel carriers, which we have many and are retiring, Bradley fighting vehicles. It includes longer range missiles. 85 kilometers was a deliberately dumbed down system. Our HIMARS are 150 and 300 kilometers. We should have given them the real deal. We should do that now. We should be giving them drones with that. We're still saying no. And this is half of the worst part of the administration's policy. The saying no to these weapons, which will bring a faster end to Moscow's aggression in Ukraine, but then the explanation of that no. They offer a variety of excuses, all of them bogus, like the Ukrainians are not equipped, trained to do this stuff. They can be trained up very quickly, as the HIMARS shows, or that our military thinks that they don't need this stuff, which is baloney. Our military gets talking points from civilians to say this, and the administration hides behind the military uniform. And then the worst of all, the truly worst of all, is they say, gee, we can't do that. Putin may escalate and we'll be in World War III. And so they have the whole country, our country, saying this. This is irresponsibility of a very high order. Let me explain. Nuclear weapons are no joke. So if we're in a conflict with a nuclear power, especially Russia, since Russia is our only peer nuclear rival, we have to consider this. What these guys don't understand or refuse to look at is the United States has had 75 years of practice with this problem. Well, 74, 73, going back to the late 1940s. Dangerous. And we developed the policy of nuclear deterrence, which goes something like this. We've got nukes, you've got nukes. You can destroy us, we can destroy you. We're not going to destroy you. We will, though, if you use your nukes on us. And we're not going to let the fact that they have nukes prevent us from defending our vital interests as we look at crises. During the Cold War against the Soviet Union, which again was significantly more powerful than Putin's Russia, we faced off over Berlin in the late 40s, Berlin in 1961, and Cuba in 1962. We did not say, as these folks have said like 8 or 10 times, we can't do this because we might wind up in a nuclear war. If we say that, they'll begin to believe it and think that they can scare us into not defending our interests. So, why is Ukraine vital to the United States? Very simple. Putin's foreign policy objective does not end at Ukraine's western border. He wants to reestablish, he's not hidden this, Russian control/influence in the entire territory that used to make up the Soviet Empire. That means all the independent states that emerged from the Soviet Union and the states that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact. Now, he wants more control over the post-Soviet states than the Warsaw Pact states, but he wants some control or influence over the Warsaw Pact states. If you look carefully at the 2 treaties Russia sent to us and to NATO in December of last year to avert this crisis, what I just said is right there in all of it. So if Putin wins in Ukraine, we have to worry about him coming for our Baltic NATO allies, who are much harder to defend than Ukraine. They're tiny, they're flat, they don't have a population of 40 million fighters like Ukraine. And if Putin thinks that he can scare us out of defending our interests in Ukraine with his nuclear wand, you think he's not going to wave it over at Tallinn or over Lithuania? That's why this constant rhetoric is not just embarrassing, not worthy of a superpower, but dangerous to American interests. Having said that, Biden on 60 Minutes, Biden at the UN this week sounded pretty good on these issues. But as recently as late July in Aspen, Jake Sullivan said this thing about World War III. It's nonsense. So these guys have to stop saying that and treat the Soviet nuclear threat with the contempt it deserves while recognizing we want to avoid a nuclear war. Because in fact, this weakness makes it more likely we could be in a dangerous standoff with Russia, again, over our NATO allies. The smart policy for the United States in stopping the Russian menace, that's not the Russian menace, it's the Putin menace to us, is arming Ukraine to the hilt so they beat the Russians. No Americans die in that situation. Okay, let's just finish off because I've been going for 20 minutes. Putin's had a bad 8 weeks, and we're beginning to see things unravel. That bad week started with the failure of the Donbass offensive, which I've described, and then the counteroffensive, which I described. But after that, he goes to a setting he thought would be congenial to him. He goes to Samarkand in Uzbekistan for a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where his pal Xi is, and lots of authoritarians. And he winds up apologizing publicly to Xi for his failures in Ukraine. He looks like a little boy with a strict teacher. Not like this tough guy who we have to fear because he's waving his nuclear wand. And he gets smacked publicly by his pal Modi, the leader of India, for his Ukraine policy. But that's not the worst of Putin's week. In Russia, local officials, you might say somewhat liberally minded, are criticizing him and calling on him to resign. Hardcore nationalists, including the guy who was deeply involved in Moscow's covert war in Donbass, are criticizing him for losing Ukraine and saying, go in with all of our force. So what's a dictator to do? He's in a dilemma. Even the most famous female singer in Russia, 72-year-old Alla Pugachev, who's beloved by all Russians and is no liberal, is smacking him for his Ukraine policy. So again, what's he going to do? Well, we learned this week 3 things. The one that got all the headlines was the mobilization, partial mobilization of Russians to serve. But he wants to nuance this because he knows if he truly goes after the whole population of Russia, the men conscripted in the army, he's going to have political problems, especially in his big cities. So he says a partial mobilization, only guys with military background, those who are interested, trying to calm people down. 2, he says he encourages and endorses referendums, plural, in the 4 territories in eastern Ukraine, which he only partly controls. The idea is these phony referendums will say, we want to join Russia. And then he'll say, please join, which is what he did with Crimea. A fake referendum, although one in the area he controlled, and then he annexes it. And then the third point is he waves his nuclear wand again. And again, he's cautious even as he's making these steps, which seem bold. He uses language that implies, but never explicitly says, there are going to be these referenda, they're going to vote to join Russia, we're going to call them Russia, and we will defend that Russian territory with our nukes. Because he's basically saying, we will use our nukes if our Russian territories is threatened. But of course, Ukraine military operations on Ukrainian soil, even if Moscow recently says it's Russia, it's not the same thing. But he's trying to scare us into not supporting Ukraine. Putin's week got worse after that. First of all, again, Biden at the UN was very strong. I praise him for that. The strength we have not seen coming from his advisors on nukes, we saw in Biden at the UN, thank God. Let's hope that that's all we're going to hear from them from now on, but I'm not confident of that. But then in Russia, what do we see happens? Everyone's freaking out about the partial mobilization. Every Russian guy who has money in his pocket trying to get on a plane to a country which accepts Russians without visas, so he's free of the draft. This is one more important indication that this is Putin's war, not the Russian people's. Bottom line, if our support for Ukraine stays at its current level, which is substantial despite my criticisms on the quality of the weapons we're sending, Ukraine wins. But at this level of support, it could take 2 years, it could take 10. If it's going to take 2 years, it's because things come apart in Russia, which could happen. But the thing about authoritarian regimes is they're stable till suddenly they're gone. In other words, we don't have great insight into their longevity. If we give the Ukrainians everything they want, and my estimation is we will do in the future what we've done in the past, meaning gradually ratchet up our support, but only gradually. If we do it that way, if we did it right away, do it that way, it could take 10 years. We do it right away, it's going to be anywhere from 6 months to 2 or 3 years. Because I think with our weaponry, not just US, but NATO weaponry, Russian forces, which are already taking a severe pounding, will be easily driven from the field. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Happy to take any questions or complaints.
I'm going to start with a few and play devil's advocate. So
please.
Is it possible to actually deny the Imperial Russian history, that the people of the Kievan Rus state don't speak the same language, don't worship the same faith predominantly, and share a common historical heritage?
There are serious overlaps in Ukrainian and Russian history and culture, and there are serious divergences. Yes, in Eastern and Central Ukraine, in Eastern Ukraine, Russian is easily the predominant language, even now. In Central Ukraine, when I was there, Russian was more common than Ukrainian, but a large balance of both. In Western Ukraine, much more Ukrainian than Russian. In terms of religion, they're all Orthodox, not all Orthodox, they're principally Orthodox Christians. The faith is the same. But one aspect of Ukrainian life, which has only changed in recent years, is that the majority church in Ukraine was under the control of the Russian church, the Moscow Patriarchate. And there are historical reasons for that, which I get into, but probably this crowd is not going to be that much interested in it. So I'll leave
We'll
that.
talk about it in class.
There was always an independent Ukrainian church, Orthodox church, which was repressed by the Soviets fiercely. It reemerged in post-independent Ukraine as the minority church. The same was true of what's called the Greek Catholics or the Uniates, which are Christians who are under the Pope. They accept Catholic dogma, but their practices are like the Eastern Orthodox. And the most striking thing about that for Westerners is that means their priests are married. But there are other things that are different as well. They were severely repressed by the Soviets, and they came back after in post-independent Ukraine. But there was established in Ukraine, with independence, a breakaway flock from the Moscow Patriarchate, which merged with other Ukrainian churches in 2018, blessed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, which led the Moscow Patriarch to break communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople. This is now getting deep into Orthodox history. The point is that the Moscow Patriarchate has been losing parishioners and parishes greatly since the February invasion. But the bottom line is almost no one rallied to the Russian flag in 2014. Putin thought that all these ethnic Russians and these Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East were going to become his troops, establish Novorossiya from Luhansk in the northeast to Odessa in the south, and it didn't happen because he just never had that draw. And now Putin is the father of Ukrainian nationalism. And it's a Ukrainian nationalism based upon hatred towards the Russian enemy because of the awful things that Russian troops are doing in Ukraine.
Is it a fair assessment in Donetsk and Luhansk that the separatists, although backed by Russia, are separatists? They wanted independence. They didn't necessarily want to be broken away from Ukraine to join Russia.
In the winter of 13-14, there were regular polls done in the East and for that in Crimea. At that time, in Crimea, it was around 42% said they either wanted to be independent of Ukraine or a part of Russia. In other words, a minority. In Luhansk and Donetsk, that same number was anywhere from 23 to 27%. A largish minority, but not even close to a plurality. So never was there that strong, overwhelming sentiment, even in Crimea, for this. But this is what they got.
So does the United States have a dog in this fight? Some of the arguments we have against this that I've fielded in the last few weeks, and Ukraine is the most corrupt country on earth. Is it?
It's about 120 out of 160, 180. And Russia's like 127 or 128.
But if we send them money, does it get to where it needs to go? The prevailing sentiment from certain political groups in the United States is, they're only getting a third of what we send them anyway.
If the folks making that claim had any evidence, we would have it. So this is a metaphysical argument based upon certain things that we know and certain things that we don't know. Corruption has been a major problem in Ukraine. At this point, there's actually zero evidence that any military assistance has gone astray. There's been lots of disinformation on this, which has been proved to be disinformation. And we've got a pretty good tracking system in place for it. But the Ukrainians have told us, please send your military to come into our country and track this stuff. And we've not done that because of anorexia in the White House about putting boots on the ground, even if they're people just tracking tracking weapons supply. And there's also a pretty good handle on the financial flows going into Ukraine. But you can be sure that if we were more willing to put people on the ground, civilian or military, to track the stuff, the Ukrainians would say yes, because they desperately need this assistance, and they don't want this line of argument against.
Okay. So social media wins with all the disinformation.
There's lots of information on social media. You have to sift through it.
Yeah. One of the stories that has arisen in the last week after Putin met with Xi and Modi and others was that his argument is the reason that this is not ending is because of Ukraine. That if the West would quit helping where they don't belong, Ukraine would negotiate a peace.
I think there's some truth to that. If the West were willing to let millions of Ukrainians, or 40 million of Ukrainians, except for those 6 or 7 who are outside the country, fall under Russian control with all the nastiness that entails after what we've seen, yeah, Ukraine would not be able to resist. But then again, as I've said now several times, Putin's nasty intentions go well beyond Ukraine. So why do we think he's going to stop at Ukraine's western border? You know, in September of 2014, right, Putin had this invasion going on of Ukraine because besides the covert war, he had to send in his army to stop the Ukrainians from winning. There was going to be a summit, a NATO summit in Great Britain. Before the NATO summit, Obama went to visit our very, very nervous Baltic allies. The day after, or 2 days after Obama visited them to reassure them, right, that they'd be safe from the Russian menace, what did Russia do? They kidnapped from Estonia an intelligence official and took him back to Russia. What was the purpose of that kidnapping? To tell the Baltic states, yeah, you're part of NATO, but you're not safe. And again, look at the Russian rhetoric. Look at what Putin did is put in those treaties. They're coming for the Baltics. So let's stop Putin on a ground of our choosing where he's already stuck because he's fighting 40 million really angry people who understand that their existence is at stake. This is a no-brainer. This is a vital American interest.
So where do the claims of Nazism come from? The rise of Nazism in Ukraine?
Well, there are Nazis all over the world, including in the United States, including in Russia. There are no Nazis in the Ukrainian government. Polls done by Pew and others have regularly demonstrated there's less anti-Semitism in Ukraine than just about anywhere in Europe, and a good bit less than in Russia. I'm sure everyone in this audience knows that the president of Ukraine is Jewish, that the prime minister, when the current president of Ukraine was elected, was Jewish, Groisman, and that when Moscow has been peddling this theme of Nazism, Ukrainian Jewish groups, and for that matter, American Jewish groups, have stood up and said, this is baloney. So it's baloney. And it's picked up by, it's pushed regularly by Russian media and Russian pals around the world, including in this country. But it's nonsense and should be treated with the contempt that it thoroughly deserves.
There was an interview of a woman in one of the villages, Izum, who's just liberated, who described a circumstance where one of the Russian soldiers approached and asked, you know, where are the Nazis? Where are the Nazis? We need to round them up. And after a few months of being beaten on the street and her stuff stolen and not being able to leave her house because of the occupation, she began to call them the Nazis.
Of course.
So she would describe the Nazis all around.
Well,
but they were not Ukrainian.
if you go and look carefully at Russian media today, you'll find statements like, the Ukrainians are the Nazis. Ukrainianness is Nazism, and we have to eradicate Nazism, in other words, Ukrainianism, from Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a bit of a problem. There is a bigger question, though, that's not perhaps either Ukraine or Russian. But it's the challenge of the people in the middle, the average citizens who are trapped between these two warring parties. So the stories of the invasion of the Russian forces, who then either pay or bribe. In some circumstances, there are Ukrainians who are willing to trade their Ukrainian passport for a Russian passport. And then they get 10,000 rubles and they can't buy anything anyway because their city's destroyed. But nonetheless, they're now Russian citizens, which will lend credence to Putin's claim on protecting Russian citizens. And now that Ukraine is taking some of those territories back, are they going to be considered collaborators?
I don't think that the average Ukrainian citizen who felt that in order to survive, he or she took a Russian passport will be treated as collaborators. I think that those who actively enforce Russian rule will be treated as collaborators. And I suspect they'll try and get out of Dodge before that happens. And that would not necessarily be a bad thing. I can see that being an easier way to manage this issue.
So Putin also, when he announced the mobilization of 300,000 troops, also announced that men between the ages of 18 and 60 rather, should not be allowed to purchase those tickets leaving the country. That is a big reason for the protests over the weekend. How far, what is the likelihood that something like that will gain traction?
I think there's a very good chance of that, but I hesitate to define traction. We, regularly polls from credible organizations in Russia have shown a majority of Russians supporting the war. While I believe that the organization, especially the Levada Center in Moscow, is a credible social science organization, I've always treated those polls with great suspicion, because any Russian who has a brain is going to think twice when someone he does not know calls them and says, "What do you think about the war in Ukraine?" I mean, someone who doesn't want trouble is going to say, "Oh, it's fine with me." But so therefore, I think those statistics are not necessarily indicative of anything. And the same polling organization, when it asked that question, asked, "Well, what do you think about the direction the country is going in?" And then the answer is like 30% say it's a good direction. That's probably in part a commentary on the war. But polls before the events of the last week did not necessarily reflect concerns citizens have for their own well-being. Now they may, or even if they don't for the same reasons, citizens understand the war is coming for them. And that probably makes them much less willing to simply go along. And that could mean political problems for Putin down the road. Maybe in the short term, maybe in the long term.
So speaking of the other kind of polls, the elections, the referenda that are being held this weekend, starting tomorrow, in fact, well, by now, starting now, because it's tomorrow there. When Russia took over Crimea in 2014, they held an election, an open election, and people were invited to vote whether or not they wanted to rejoin Russia. We all know from elections here, if you don't go vote, the people who did go vote get to decide what our politics are. If you didn't go vote in that referendum in Crimea, the people who did got to decide your future. Or did they? What do you think about that?
No, the Crimean referendum was a joke. The Russians claimed, I don't remember this precisely, I don't know, 87% voted and 80+% voted yes. But then there were some statistics provided by a Russian social scientist that was briefly on, I think it may have been even the Kremlin website, but some non-opposition website in Russia. And Paul Gregory something, I'm forgetting his name precisely, wrote an article on this for Forbes back in the spring of 2014. And the statistics that he had that came from these notes were something like 50 or 60% of the population of Crimea voted in the referendum, And if it was 50% voted, 60% voted in favor, 60% voted, 50% voted in favor. So the point was roughly 30%, between 18 and 30% of the people of Crimea voted for joining Russia, whereas they reported overwhelming majority with super high turnout. So even that was a bogus referendum.
Well, I understand that in Donetsk and Luhansk, for example, the police are going to be going door to door to
Right.
make sure that everyone votes so that every vote is counted.
Right.
Isn't that going to solve the problem?
Well, it'll solve, in Putin's mind, it may solve the problem. In the minds of anyone who has eyes to see, no.
How would you vote if the police came to your house? So this is a challenge. But back to the average citizens, though, we're still, who's bombing whom? Zaporizhia, for example, the nuclear power plant at Zaporizhia, why would the Russians, who already control it, why would they be bombing close to it if they want to keep control of it?
Well, I think what they're doing is not bombing close to it. They place their artillery and their troops in and around it, and they shoot from there, figuring the Ukrainians will not fire back. That's the issue.
Okay. But are the Ukrainians firing back?
Russians say yes, the Ukrainians say no, and I have seen no indication the Ukrainians are firing back.
Okay. How about Zelensky's plan to also control certain media outlets who are pro-Russian? So they're Ukrainian media outlets, but they have a pro-Russian message. Is it a tit for tat with Russia shutting down any anti-war outlets?
The Ukrainians did shut down a couple of essentially Russian-controlled outlets months before the big invasion. And this was one of the things that annoyed Putin, which may have contributed to his decision to invade. Those outlets were held in violation of Ukrainian law. They, in theory, had an owner who was like a middle-income German. I'm not making this up. And was shut down. I frankly did not have a problem with that, although I'm a strong believer in media freedom. There has been steps to control the media since, which I think are problematic. And historically, there's been a problem in Ukraine with government officials trying to control the media. The only Ukrainian president who did not play games with the media was Yushchenko, who won the Orange Revolution election when I was in Ukraine.
So the extent of war crimes that have been discussed committed by Russian soldiers on Ukrainian territory.
Right.
Number one, how will they be adjudicated? Who's going to hold somebody accountable for those mass atrocities? And number two, do the Ukrainians commit similar crimes?
On the first question, there's an intensive effort by Ukrainian officials to gather evidence. The U.S. is helping. I hosted yesterday the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, who's one of the people in Ukraine with this responsibility. He had an excellent meeting with Merrick Garland in Washington this week. In fact, Garland was in Kyiv meeting with the earlier Prosecutor General in Ukraine on the same subject. So credible evidence is being accumulated. People are talking about going to the International Criminal Court and the European Human Rights Court and others. So I think justice will be sought. There have been reports of Ukrainian war crimes, and I suspect some of them are true, but I don't think there have been massive Ukrainian war crimes.
Okay.
And certainly it's not the policy to conduct war crimes, which seems to be the case with the Russians.
In 94-ish, when Yeltsin met with
Do you know about the Budapest Memorandum?
yes. So the Budapest Memorandum laid out a plan, let's say, to have Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons and its heavier military artillery in exchange for protection from Russia, from the United States, and from the UK. is this current activity by Russia not their carrying out their promise
Well,
to protect Ukraine?
there's no question that Russia violated the Budapest Memorandum, the UN Charter, and the own peace agreements that Russia and Ukraine had signed. So this is a massive violation of international law. And that's before you get to the war crimes and those violations. If Ukraine had not given up its nukes, chances are Russia would not have invaded. But this is what it is now. Ukrainians can also complain bitterly that Western support was not consistent with the Budapest Memorandum. I have friends who negotiated that and say, well, no, we never gave guarantees, we only gave assurances, which is a good lawyer's answer, but not a good politician's answer. And of course, while I think we should be doing more, we have given substantial aid to Ukraine. And I think enough for them to win, as already explained.
And what about the expansion of NATO? Didn't the United States give expressed promises that we would not expand NATO into former Soviet space?
No, this is an argument, excuse me, this is an argument, an issue of great controversy. I just wrote a review, which won't come out probably for another couple of months, of a book by a woman historian whose name escapes me right now. The name of the book is Not an Inch Further, which is actually a phrase that Jim Baker uttered to the then Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, but that was not about NATO membership. That was about NATO forced dispositions in East Germany, which is a very different subject than NATO membership for former Warsaw Pact members. But it has been interpreted by Putin and his allies as meaning no NATO expansion.
So that's enough devil's advocate.
Okay.
So I do have a question about NATO though, because the arguments that Russia uses that they needed to go into Ukraine to protect Ukraine or to protect Ukraine from American and Western influence and to keep NATO from expanding into Ukraine. What are the odds that Ukraine was ever going to get into NATO in the first place, or into the EU for that matter?
I think the odds have gone up since this big invasion, but you're right. In 2014, when Moscow seized Crimea, even before that, when Yanukovych was still president, Ukraine had a constitution which said you will be no member of any bloc. And at that point, probably no more than 25 or 30% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. So if Ukraine eventually becomes a member, it will be another part of Putin's legacy. Now the number of Ukrainians who want to join NATO is a substantial majority for very clear reasons. Again, it's worth remembering this whole crisis began because of a trade agreement between the EU and Ukraine. Just shows you how bad.
It wasn't EU accession. I mean, they were not
correct.
joining the EU.
No, it's just a trade agreement.
Yeah.
Just shows you how bad a statesman Putin is.
As a sovereign state, they have the right to make those agreements.
Unless you believe in Russian imperial history.
Which takes us back to the beginning. So we've got one question in the chat. Earlier you were talking about if Ukraine falls, the Baltic states will be next. And Shelley points out that sounds like the domino theory that didn't work so well in Vietnam. Can you explain the difference?
Well, first, Lee Yuan Q, the long-time leader of Singapore, with clear autocratic tendencies, but believed to be a very shrewd man, says, in fact, that had the United States not intervened in Vietnam, you would not have had the emergence of a vibrant, independent Southeast Asia, as evident in the organization ASEAN, which actually was created in the late 60s. So it's possible that Vietnam was not as large a failure for our policy as we think it is. But let's put that argument to the side, having dealt with the first hypothesis. I can't be sure that Putin's going into Estonia. And I'm certainly not going to say that if Ukraine falls, the Baltics definitely fall next. What I am saying is that Putin's own statements, and I would argue to a certain extent his activities, point in this direction. And to my mind, the burden is on the person arguing the opposite, seeing what Putin's doing in Ukraine after what Putin has done in Georgia, which means that it seems to vindicate that when he says, these are my territorial ambitions, he actually means it.
And that brings me to Georgia and Moldova.
Right.
So are they the more pressing?
Well, they're
at
easy.
risk?
They're easier targets because they don't have the NATO membership. But it also means that action against them is not nearly as significant geopolitically for Putin the conqueror.
That's a nice phrase for him. I think Moldova, where's our Romanian contingent? How would Moldova feel about, or how would Romania feel if Moldova decides to, or Putin decides to reclaim Moldova as its own? Terrible.
Yes.
Don, you wanna expand on that? Oh, Chet's got the microphone. And by the way, if you've got questions, and please ask a question. I'm the only one that gets to editorialize. No. But do ask a question. Ambassador Herbst has a great deal of experience. He was also ambassador in Kazakhstan and elsewhere. And so, test his knowledge. He's brilliant. What do you think about Moldova and Russia?
Well, Russia has been a difficult neighbor for centuries. Moldova, as we all know, was annexed by Russia, by the Soviet Union after World War II. The same policy of forced Russification and population mobility. Moldavians were taken out of Moldova and moved to Siberia. Russians were moved in. So the same identity issues, mixed families, people with friends, and speaking both Russian and Romanian, because that's the Moldovan language. It's Romanian. It's a Latin-based language. But similar identity problems of affiliation now with Russian culture because of these decades of Russification exist there as well. I know, just as a small anecdote, we were there a few years ago in 2015, and Putin was punishing Moldova for, and it was punishing it economically. It was so some of the best Moldavian exports, wine and fruits, were being rejected by Russia for political reasons that Putin had in mind. I don't mean to get too long.
Not a lot of love lost there.
Questions?
Do you think there's a chance that Putin gets unpopular enough that he'll be forced out of office?
I think that's a real possibility, but we're just not in a position. I'm not in a position to say when that would happen. But we're clearly seeing unhappiness across Russia with this latest move, and it's hard to imagine that going away. I mean, they could repress it and maybe put a lid on it for a while. But if conscription continues and bodies continue to come home, that ultimately could have a very serious impact on Putin's political future.
A lot of the signs of the protests over the weekend were, time for you to go.
Yes.
So.
My hearing aid cut out, so if you may have answered two of these already, but one, what do you think the chances of Russia using tactical nukes in this conflict are? And two, do you think it would be a good idea for Ukraine to join NATO after this is all over?
I think it's highly unlikely that he will use tactical nuclear weapons. That's not it's not zero, the possibility. I think it's very low. And again, I think the statement Biden made first at 60 Minutes, then over the weekend, actually, the UN, have decreased the chances, the already low chance that Putin would do that. But we can't rule it out. But keep in mind, there's fallout even from a tactical nuke that will hit other countries in Europe and Russia itself. And that's the problem. And of course, even more so, Xi will be mortified. And Putin has to take that into account as well. By the way,
Yeah, he can't risk alienating China.
by the way, something I should have mentioned is that the Russian failure thus far in Ukraine and the effectiveness of 25-year-old American technology in the form of HIMARS, I think has made Xi more cautious about launching a military strike on Taiwan. So the folks who argue we should not help Ukraine because we have to worry about China don't understand how strong action in one part of the world improves your situation in another part of the world.
All right, we're over here on your right.
So only the United States, Western Europe, the other Anglosphere countries, Japan, I think like South Korea, maybe a few others, small countries, are directly sanctioning Russia. Like most of the world's population isn't. Like, I don't think any part of Latin America or Africa is, to my knowledge. Maybe there's a few exceptions. Could you explain why that is? Like why Mexico or Brazil or Nigeria or Indonesia, like big countries, are just not sanctioning Russia?
Because they don't believe it's something that concerns them. And they don't want to worsen their relationship with a large country. This is actually, while I consider it unfortunate, it's not a surprise. It's entirely natural. And I was actually amazed when a diplomatic historian, a smart guy, wrote an article 6 or so months ago saying, the whole world's not with us. And I thought, excuse me, aren't you an historian? You ever hear of something called the non-aligned movement, which existed during the Cold War? Then, too, a majority of the world's population was not with us as we took on and defeated the Soviet Union. So get real. We should not be astonished by this, and we should not be put off by it. Yes, to the extent that we can counter Russian influence in that part of the world, let's do it. But let that not deter us in stopping Putin on the ground in Ukraine.
I was wondering if you could address how many foreign military people are in Ukraine fighting, or are there any contractors in there fighting with the Ukrainian military? And how long will the Ukrainian military last? I mean, do they have enough military people to last 10 years?
Okay. I don't have statistics on the number of foreign volunteers in Ukraine. I believe certainly it's in the thousands, maybe even breaches of 10,000. I don't know, but it's thousands. Yes, we know there have been prisoners of war held by the Russians, including Americans. I'm unaware of them being, you might say, classic mercenaries, meaning receiving a large salary for this. I know that there are a lot of people who are been touched by what Russia is doing to Ukraine and believe Ukraine needs their help. And as for how long they can last, look, Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine, actually a little bit more than 3 times, but their people have zero interest in this war, or only a tiny fraction of their people believe this war is worth fighting. Whereas again, the vast majority of Ukrainians understand it's we either beat the Russians or we face a very nasty fate. So I don't think manpower cuts in favor of Putin in this conflict. But there is one thing Ukraine does not have enough of on its own, and that's weapons. And that's where our role and our European allies' role is very important.
Okay, we're back here in the center.
And we've had a request. Would you please stand up when you ask your question?
Great. First off, thanks for imparting your wisdom on all of us. I have 2 questions. One of them is pretty short, but first one, should the U.S. consider, and if so, how should the U.S. consider the likelihood in formulating Russian policy of the likely next leader of the country being potentially less liberal than Putin. Zhirinovsky is no longer among us, but it's not unlikely that a Strelkov or somebody of the more militant type might be in power next in Russia. And how should the US consider that in formulating its policy towards Russia, and if so, how? Second, just interested in your prognostication of the likelihood of Russia invading Kazakhstan next rather than the Baltics.
Some of my colleagues in Washington who argue for little or no support for Ukraine often make the argument that Putin is actually about as good a Russian leader as we're going to get. I'm not going to tell you that they're wrong, but they have yet to offer one credible reason why they're right. We do have a reasonable sense that Putin's hardline Siloviki pals were not enthusiastic about this invasion. So that would be an argument against the more illiberal Russian to come. There's also I call it a standard of Russian history that when they conduct an unsuccessful foreign war, they get liberalizing change. That happened after the Crimean War. The serfs were freed. After the Russo-Japanese War, they established a Duma, a parliament. After World War I, but of course then you got communism, which turned out to be far worse. But that's not how that originally moved. And at the end of the Cold War. And of course, you even got the removal of Khrushchev, but 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this has been although in that case, the guy was not more, Brezhnev was not more liberal than Khrushchev. So the point is, if you look at the pattern of Russian history, it's not a bad pattern from our point of view. Now, your second question was?
Kazakhstan.
Oh, Kazakhstan, that's right. I think that's highly unlikely because China's already made clear to not do that. But certainly Nazarbayev was worried about that when Putin made his famous statement at Lake Seliger in August of 2014 that Kazakhstan was an artificial country.
Chet?
My question, is basically on the IAEA.
No, just hold it closer to your mouth.
My question is basically on the IAEA and what they can do as far as nuclear reactors. I know we have problems now in Ukraine, but they seem to be all over Europe and in China and every place else. I was wondering if they could do something on the Security Council as far as vote that there's a no-go at any time, anywhere, and they should be forced to vote on it now before it ever happens and see how they stand as far as nuclear weapons. But they should give the IAEA some type of preference. And I'm sorry, but because they have that now.
I was pleased to see the deal that it sent the IAEA into the nuclear reactor in Zaporizhia. Unfortunately, they only went for a few days visit. They didn't stay there permanently, which would have been a real solution. The problem, though, is that such developments require agreement by the parties. And while the Ukrainians are ready to give agreement, the Russians are not. So I welcome a more visible IAEA role, but only by persuading Moscow to open up will that role pan out. So they've had one visit. It would be nice to try and get another, or better yet, get a permanent president. But that would require some leverage on the Kremlin.
Two last questions. One here. Okay. So clearly Putin is learning that the philosophy will be greeted as liberators does not always turn out well. How much of that is a misunderstanding of his own military's capability versus the likelihood that the Ukrainians are fighting back? How much of it is bad information from Russian intelligence that we know was operating in Ukraine in the lead up to war versus him not wanting to hear what it was that he was hearing from the intelligence he was getting?
I think you provide a good description of the situation. And I do think that Putin has the ability, if he has the wish, to decide tomorrow to end the war in Ukraine and to declare victory on his state-controlled media and get away with it. But I don't think he's ready to make that decision yet. I think he believes he can still win. I mean, by my count, he's had 3 defeats on the battlefield: Kyiv, Donbass, and then the counteroffensive. But it is true, in theory, he has a much stronger military and he has all these weapons. And so I think he's coming back for a 4th bite of the apple. Maybe it's going to take 6 bites of the apple before he decides he can't win. Maybe we're going to have to provide far more sophisticated weapons. He decides, well, it's just too much. That day may come, but it may not. I just don't know.
I think it's fitting we have a student. That'll be your last one.
Your final question.
Hi. So it is my understanding, with the loss of Russian military life on the front, that Russia is currently deploying under-trained soldiers on their front lines, specifically when they move troops to the south. They left the more underprepared troops in the northern region, and that's why the pushback was so readily available. And I was wondering, with the current conscription and public resentment for the war, how long do you think Russia can hold out on both the home and on the war fronts?
Again, this is a crystal ball question. There's, I think, little doubt that the Russian citizens are unenthusiastic soldiers. And so they're trying to escape service, and they're trying to flee the country if they can't escape service within Russia. But it's also true that repression works, at least up to a point. It has worked thus far, but at a certain point, repression no longer works, and that's when everything comes undone. I think it's safe to say we're approaching that point, but I don't know how close we are to it. So it's anyone's guess. But the fact that we're seeing what we're seeing now, the very first days of this mobilization, is from Putin's point of view, a very bad sign. Whether he sees it that way, of course, is a different matter.
I want to ask a follow-on. I'm sorry, we
Okay.
just said the last one, but one of the observations of the soldiers who have died, the Russian soldiers who have died in Ukraine, is that they are ethnically not Russian. They're Chechen, they're Buryatia.
Right.
And now that Putin is calling up ethnic Russians, the landscape is going to change for how willing the Russian people are to accept this kind of a loss. For what? How is that going to affect that?
No, you're absolutely right. But I would add one more category to those who've been taken in over proportional amounts. It's also ethnic Russians from small villages. What he's tried to avoid is a big call up from the cities. And people understand this, but there's a certain fatalism in Russia about the way the world works. So they just kind of accept it. But again, enough kids get called up from enough middle class and up homes. And, maybe it's not going to be 1,000 or 6,000 on the street. Maybe it's going to be 100,000. And at a certain point, repression doesn't work.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you.